worked on Egypt with a next-door neighbor who is a good neighbor. They're friends of mine, but they happened to build a dam which closed up water going into a thing called the Nile. I think if I'm Egypt, I want to have water in the Nile, and we're working on that one. It's a problem, but it's going to get solved. They built one of the biggest dams in the world, a little bit outside of Egypt. You know about that. You've been hearing about that one. And that turned out to be a big problem.
He stood on the stage, drying sweat from his brow, eyes blazing. Ethiopia had just turned on the turbines of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam GERD. Overnight, a landlocked country claimed control of one of Africa's greatest water arteries. Upstream, in Egypt, warnings flew. In Washington, alarms were sounding, what no one noticed. At first, this dam was only the beginning, because around the same time, secret agreements were being signed: port deals, maritime access, shifting alliances. Ethiopia was quietly redrawing its map of power, and the US suddenly found its role in the Horn of Africa in peril. In this video, we'll unpack every twist of that moment, why the US is unsettled, what Ethiopia's next moves are, and how this could reshape the power balance in Africa and beyond, and it all starts with water. Ethiopia built GERD on the Blue Nile, spending years navigating international pressure and downstream fears. For Egypt and Sudan, it represented both promise and threat, clean power and development versus possible water shortages. But beyond power generation and water flow, GERD is a symbol of Ethiopia saying, "We decide our future." Washington's unease isn't just about downstream disruptions, it's about precedent. Which nation gets to control life-giving resources in Africa? And what if GERD is merely the opening act for Ethiopia's bold strategy? To find out, you might think the next step is diplomacy. But it isn't. We'll see how it moves into region-wide port deals, territorial questions, and even military strategy. Ethiopia has been landlocked since 1993 when Eritrea separated. But in 2024, it signed a Memorandum of Understanding MOU with Somaliland. Ethiopia gets 19 kilometers of coast leased from Somaliland in exchange for recognizing Somaliland's independence. Why does that matter so much? Because access to the sea changes trade, military posture, and diplomatic leverage. Suddenly, Ethiopia isn't limited to Djibouti or ports in neighboring countries. It could have its own coastal foothold. This alarms not just neighbors like Somalia, but also global powers including the US, which has long used strategic port access, naval routes, and control of sea lanes to maintain influence. We'll see in the next section how port access links to security and why Washington might now view Ethiopia as less predictable. The Horn of Africa is one of the hotspots in global counterterrorism operations. U.S. forces, allied with Ethiopia over many years, have relied on stable access and predictable partners to keep threats like al-Shabaab in check. Washington has also depended on Ethiopia's cooperation for broader regional stability, Red Sea security, migrant routes, threats in Somalia. Now, with Ethiopia seeking direct access to a seaport, possibly supporting or negotiating bases commercial or naval, some of those assumptions are being challenged. The push for sea access via Somaliland, the claims over a Sab port in Eritrea, and tensions with neighbors are raising questions in Washington about whether Ethiopia might act more independently, if not antagonistically, in issues the U.S. once considered its domain. What if Ethiopia's next move isn't just trade, but strategic positioning that shifts regional security calculations? We'll examine those risks soon. While Ethiopia projects strength abroad, at home it is fragile. The Tigray conflict, ethnic unrest in Amhara and Oromia regions, and disputes over federal versus regional power are tearing at national unity. Why does US care? Because internal weakness is external opportunity. Instability allows external powers to step in. US aid and influence can be leveraged but also can backfire. Moreover, Ethiopia's internal narrative has grown increasingly nationalist. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his government frame many of Washington's concerns about human rights, sanctions, regional diplomacy as interference. That narrative gives domestic political cover for more assertive foreign policy, but internal fragility also imposes constraints. It means some of Ethiopia's moves are risky gambles: port deals, border talks, recognition of Somaliland. These could provoke backlash, regional conflict, or diplomatic isolation. Washington worries that Ethiopia might push too far before its capacity to absorb the cost weakens. Next, the chessboard of alliances. Who Ethiopia is making friends with matters a lot. Over the past decade, Ethiopia has been quietly building ties beyond Western influence. China, for example, has been a major financier of infrastructure across Africa. Russia is making headway in arms and diplomacy. Regional players like Turkey and Gulf states are also involved. This means Ethiopia has more options now than it once did. Washington doesn't hold all the cards. In this context, Ethiopia's move with Somaliland looks less like a bilateral deal and more like a signal. We have other partners if you try to push us in two corners. Washington fears that Ethiopia will play its alliances to preserve autonomy even if that means shifting sides or balancing between powers. What happens if Ethiopia becomes a pivot point in the Red Sea, hosting foreign naval access or aligning with rising powers on contentious issues? The next section explores just that, how Ethiopia's choices could reconfigure the US's strategic map in the region. Ethiopia's claimed two access ports along the Red Sea, tensions with Eritrea, disputes with Somalia over Somaliland, all these are not just local squabbles. They affect sea lanes, trade routes, migration corridors, and influence over the Bab el Mandeb Strait, a key choke point. Additionally, GERD's opening has stirred a water security crisis. Egypt and Sudan Sea downstream risk. Washington has historically tried to play mediator here, but its influence is being challenged. Ethiopia's move to operate GERD without full downstream agreement or with only limited binding assurances shows a new assertiveness. Combine that with possible militarization of port access, and Ethiopia becomes not just a country of interest, but a pivot in regional stability, something Washington has to account for. We'll see in the conclusion what that could mean for both countries. Ethiopia's next move isn't some distant hypothetical, it's happening now. The GERD is operational, port deals in Somaliland and access to the sea are underway. Internal tensions swirl, but they strengthen in a paradoxical way. The leaders resolve to assert national sovereignty. Washington's tools, diplomatic pressure, aid conditionality, sanctions are real, but their effectiveness is slipping. So what are the stakes? For Ethiopia, a chance to rise as a regional power, one that trades dependency for autonomy, asserts its voice, and shapes its own destiny. For Washington, less control of key choke points, more competition in influence, and the risk that strategic assumptions in the Horn are outdated. In the end, this is more than a story about water or ports. It's about whether Ethiopia can reshape the map of power in East Africa and whether Washington can accept that map if it looks different than what it imagined. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't the loudest, it's the one that changes the board forever. But that's another layer that makes Washington uneasy. Ethiopia isn't just diversifying its friends, it's testing how far it can go without US approval. Take China, for instance. Beijing has invested billions in Ethiopia's railways, roads, and industrial parks. These projects aren't just about infrastructure. They're a blueprint for economic dependence. Every train line that connects Addis Ababa to Djibouti, every Chinese-built factory, ties Ethiopia more closely to a rival superpower. For Washington, this looks like a long-term bet that Ethiopia might be pulled firmly into Beijing's orbit, and then there's Russia, while Moscow doesn't match China's financial firepower. It has something Ethiopia values: military support without lectures on human rights. Russian trainers, arms deals, and political backing at the UN are small pieces in a larger puzzle. Each one signals that Ethiopia has more options than Washington would prefer to admit. Even Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are playing a role, investing in Ethiopian agriculture and offering financial aid. These ties provide Ethiopia with short-term cash and long-term political flexibility. In the eyes of Washington, that makes the country harder to pressure because every time one door closes, another opens. Here's the part that really stings for the US. Ethiopia's leaders know this. They know they don't have to bend every time Washington frowns, and they're beginning to act like it. But the real question is, how far will they go? Aligning with China and Russia is one thing. Playing power games on the Red Sea and Nile Basin is another. And that is where Ethiopia's next move could transform from bold diplomacy into a geopolitical earthquake. To see why, we need to look at how all these alliances feed into one of the world's most contested waterways.